Podcast 87, Startling Revelations. Podcast 87, Startling Revelations, reveals some things I learned about the cooperative after my employment began in July 1973. I was surprised by the reactions of a school system's staff members when I made my first in-service presentation concerning the implementation of the new special education law. There were funding issues in the beginning. It seemed there were always funding issues. Podcast 87, Startling Revelations. As a result of the cooperative's 7 school systems deciding to provide the bulk of the state's funding for implementing school psychological and special education services, I had a job. I guess I never thought that I didn't have it from the time that Bill Oakes, the CEO, and I met with the board of directors at their meeting in the late spring of 1973. The fact that the board of directors hadn't completely secured the fundings for my position or the employment of the graduate assistants during the coming school year was a surprise. There were many things about the cooperative that I did not know. It took years for me to discover some of them and understand their significance. For example, I thought TVA was generously funding the administrative operation of the organization. I also assumed that Bill Oakes understood that the instructions for writing grants had to be meticulously followed. Another assumption I had made, in error, was that the 7 member systems had a strong commitment to supporting the cooperative and to working together on behalf of the region. TVA had made it clear that it was committed to damming the Little Tennessee River and creating a model city that would massively improve the region's economic and cultural development. They had engaged the Boeing Corporation out of California, all managing agency for the creation of the model city, Timberlake. Boeing had already sent to Knoxville a team of planners who were working full-time on the development of Timberlake. A senior executive from Boeing, John Doig, had been meeting regularly with Bill as they planned together. Many years after Bill's accidental death in December 1975, causing me to fill his vacant position, the following situation was revealed to me by an original board of directors member. I think it was around 1990 that Billy Joe Littleton, chairperson of the LTVEC board of directors at that time, related the following information. As I recall, he said this situation began a year or so before I was employed. Bill Oakes and the board of directors were told by one of TVA's senior executives that TVA was providing LTVEC with $60,000 so that the cooperative could employ and support an executive director and a secretary. All the cooperative had to do was to complete a grant application to TVA for the funds. As soon as the application was submitted and processed by the organization, the funds would be released. Bill wrote the grant and submitted it. TVA said that the grant could not be funded because Bill had incorrectly addressed some of the requirements within the grant application. The cooperative was reassured that the funds would be provided as soon as Bill made the corrections. Bill rewrote the grant. Again, TVA stated that there were still errors in the grant application that had to be corrected before the money could be released. This submission and need for revision dance continued as the year the funds were intended to be spent quickly approached. The cooperative was assured that even if the year the funds were to be used began, the full $60,000 would be awarded to the cooperative. There was no danger that the $60,000 would be reduced by 1/12 as each month passed within the designated funded year. Once it became clear to LTVC's Board of Directors that the year would begin without receiving the needed funds from TVA, the board decided to borrow at least $30,000 to ensure it had the actual funds needed to operate during the designated year. The board members were confident that the TVA grant would be approved no later than December of the coming year. Since the grant would be approved and funded for the full $60,000, they would simply use $30,000 of it to repay the loan. Since that amount was designated to pay for the first 6 months of the cooperative's operating expenses, that was what the borrowed money was used for. There would be no difficulty concerning the appropriateness of paying the loan, went their reasoning. The LTVEC Board of Directors quickly learned that area banks would not loan the organization $30,000. 3 individuals decided that each would obtain a personal bank loan of $10,000 to lend to the cooperative. The 3 people were Frank McClellan, who was the chairman of the cooperative's Board of Directors, and the Blount County Commissioner, representing the county government of the cooperative's board. Billy Joe Littleton, a representative of the board of the Lenoir City School Board, as well as the chairman of that system's board, and Bill Oakes, the executive director of LTVEC. TVA approved the grant application in January for $30,000. When the cooperative protested that it had been promised the full $60,000 of the grant, the TVA senior executive informed the board that the board had totally misinterpreted the information that had been provided to its members. He said that TVA never provides funds retroactively in its grants. He did not understand how such a misinterpretation could have taken place. When I started my employment with LTVEC, I had no idea that it had a $30,000 debt with no means of repaying the 3 individuals who had loaned the organization the funds. In retrospect, these 3 individuals had great faith in the future of the cooperative and high confidence in the program that the graduate students and I were about to create. At the end of July and into early August of 1973, I was busy planning my presentation to the teaching staff within each of the 7-member school systems. I was told that none of the teachers had been made aware that they would be implementing the new state special education law. My presentations would constitute the first time that they would learn what a dramatic impact the law would have on their work. I needed to do a good job. As I had mentioned earlier, I had thoroughly studied the law and was exhilarated to be informing the teachers about these new resources available for their failing students. Based upon my 2 years as a school psychologist in the inner city schools of St. Petersburg, Florida, and my experiences last year as a school psychologist graduate assistant in the Knoxville City School System, I knew that it was highly likely that all the teachers had several disabled students in their classrooms. Those children were the ones who were failing while their teachers struggled to find educational strategies to help them, but with little or no success. Up to this school year, resources were lacking to engage school psychologists and other professionals to evaluate and identify children who had disabilities that qualified them for receiving special assistance. For children who qualified, the school system would receive additional funding from the state to pay for those extra services. If the special services the disabled child needed could be provided in the regular classroom by a specialist, then they would be. If the special services could be implemented by the classroom teacher with consultation from various specialists, then the consultation would be provided. I was so pleased to be the one to give the teachers this good news. At last, they would be getting additional assistance for those children floundering educationally in their classes. Up to this point, special education was for only those children who anyone could look at and say, he needs to go to some special education center and get some help. Then the child would disappear. That child would never be in a regular public school building. Now, for the first time, the teachers would have someone trained in school psychology, trained in the state-of-the-art evaluations of children with the kinds of disabilities a layperson would not recognize. How happy these educators were going to be that they would be getting the help they have been requesting for years. Of course, I would have to be careful in my presentation to point out that there were changes in how the teachers would have to respond to the children's unique special needs. But that's where the school psychological services would be most helpful to them. Within the service provider's psychoeducational evaluations would be recommendations as to strategies the teacher could implement in an attempt to improve the child's learning. Naturally, the teacher would need to keep data to determine if those strategies were actually helping the child. If the child was not making progress, the service provider would work with the teacher to make adjustments. Naturally, the teacher would need to keep data to determine if those strategies were actually helping the child. If the child was not making progress, the service provider would work with the teacher to make adjustments. Of course, the child's parents would be involved in the planning, evaluating, and adjusting process for the child. Other relevant professionals would be involved as well. Because of this new law that I would explain in my presentations, the teachers were finally getting help. The teachers at last would have a support system in their search for a way to make a true difference in the life of a child. Who, in education, wouldn't be gratified by this change in Tennessee's educational model? While it was true that during the first year of funding the law, there was no money for an increase in special education teachers or other direct service providers, that kind of funding would come the following year. This first year was for significant increases in evaluating and identifying children with disabilities that significantly interfered with the normal educational experience offered to all children. In that sense, the special education law was a civil rights law. All children have the right to an equal opportunity for an education. Only when a child has an identified disability that is clearly interfering with the child's ability to benefit from that normal educational process, are educators allowed to treat that child differently in school? In essence, the special education law allows the school system not to treat the disabled child like all the other children. This is a serious legal matter. The law requires procedural safeguards so that those aspects of the child's educational life that can be dealt with in a normal manner shall be dealt with as they are with any other child. The special education law contains many directives on how to maintain records to ensure the child receives an appropriate education, both in the area of his special needs and in those areas that require that he be treated like any other child in the school system. The directives and subsequent paperwork appeared to me to be very logical. In fact, maintaining the child's educational records as required made whatever adjustments the teacher had to make with the child more manageable than simply trying to help the child without a carefully developed plan and monitoring system. I did realize that the number of school psychology doctoral students working in the schools was not great enough to meet the needs once the teachers began realizing how many children they had who probably had qualifying disabilities. Still, the ratio of students to school psychology service providers was lower than it had been for me when I worked in the St. Petersburg or Knoxville schools. I couldn't do anything about the lack of adequate funding the state was providing, other than to acknowledge that it wasn't enough. I could note that this year's funding for special needs children was the highest it had ever been. Taking a deep breath, I entered the crowded cafeteria of the high school. It was packed with teachers and staff from all three of the schools in this system. The air was buzzing with small group conversations as people were asking each other how their summer vacations had been. The teachers were eager to get started. My presentation was the first big event of their 3 days of meeting that began their school year. Energy was high in the air. Polite applause followed my introduction to them. My presentation started with how pleased I was to be the one to share with them that the special education law newly passed by the Tennessee State Legislature was finally providing them with assistance for the evaluation of their poor learners to determine if they had a disability that fit the state's criteria of disabilities. If a child was found to have a qualifying disability, the next step was determining if that disability was interfering with the child's learning. Assuming that a child had a disability and that disability was inhibiting his learning, a plan needed to be developed that remediated the teaching-learning effort. The school psychology doctoral student could provide assistance in planning how to adjust the classroom instructions to most benefit the child without overburdening the classroom teacher. If the disabling condition required some educational services to be provided outside of the classroom, plans would be developed to accommodate those needs. My comments were met with glassy-eyed stares and silence. Total silence. I thought there would be lots of smiles and nodding of heads. I was wrong. while I was unsure of the meaning of their nonverbal feedback, I realized that I was not a big hit. Then my presentation went into how the law mandated that records be kept documenting 3 phases. First, the evaluation process. Then the group determination process that decided if a child's disability was interfering with his learning, and, if so, what was going to be done to change that. And finally, evaluating the child on at least a quarterly basis to determine if the intervention plan was working. If it wasn't working, the plan needed to be changed. Of course, the child's parents had to be involved and approve of all the decisions. This last part brought people to their feet. They were shaking their fists at me while shouting statements such as the following: "You are destroying American education! Who are you to tell us what to do? You're a fool! No one can do all that for one child and teach a classroom of normies." The high school principal escorted me to my car. I had 2 more presentations to make that day. Fortunately, that first school system had the most overtly negative responses to what I had to share. My concept as to how the new special education law was going to be received needed adjustment. It was clear that I had to prepare the doctoral students for the negative responses they might be encountering as they perform their psychoeducational assessments. The graduate students had to know and fully understand the law before they stepped into a school. They needed to understand the fear the teachers felt and why they felt it. These doctoral students were the change agents. Introducing these new procedures to educators would be similar to my Army work at the Special Warfare Center. The doctoral students needed to be trained as if they were a part of a special warfare team entering isolated communities with the mission of assisting the local population to utilize the new resources being made available to them. Above all else, doctoral students needed to know how important it was that they value the educators they worked with. It was absolutely essential that they value even those educators who strongly disagreed with them on how to serve a special needs child. To my way of thinking, we were assaulting the belief systems of many of those educators opposing the concepts of the special education law. Their concept of the classroom teacher's role was that they were to teach children who were functioning at grade level, ready to learn the lessons to be presented, and at the rate they were presented. If a child could not do that, the child was to be removed from the classroom and fixed. Not only was the child's learning problem to be fixed, but when he returned to the classroom, he was to be caught up on the lessons he had missed, so that he was ready to receive the lesson for that day. The special education law did not support this belief system. Changing someone's core belief system is very hard for that individual and very hard for the change agent to accomplish. There was much to do to prepare the graduate students before they entered their first school buildings. I knew that we could do it. I had participated in the training of change agents in Army training exercises out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Several times a year, the Army trainees went into the rural mountain communities of North Carolina to practice what we instructors had taught in war games with Special Forces trainees. I would be doing the same basic training with the graduate students in rural communities on the other side of the mountains, the Tennessee side. As for the doctoral students, fortunately, I knew all of them. I had been studying with them for the past 2 years. I knew their strengths, their determination to be successful, and their overwhelming desire to help children. There was an added bonus. They were really smart. It wasn't until well into August that Bill discovered that the cooperative was not going to receive the designated special education funds for the psychological services from the state on a monthly basis. The state had informed him and the superintendents that the special education funds were to be released on a reimbursement basis at the end of each quarter of the year. The first quarter of the year included July, August, and September. The cooperative did not have the funds to pay the graduate assistants their first paychecks at the end of August. They would receive their first paychecks at the end of September or in early October. I spent a lot of time on the telephone explaining to bank officials and creditors why many of the graduate students could not make their payments on time. I requested that they not be penalized for their late payments. To the best of my knowledge, none of the graduate students were assigned extra fees for their late payments.